The human psyche does not reveal itself through casual introspection. It guards its architecture behind layers of conditioning, trauma, and the accumulated sediment of unconscious habit. Yet throughout history, certain individuals have penetrated these veils, constructing maps of the inner world with remarkable consistency across cultures and centuries. The Hermetic tradition stands among the most sophisticated of these cartographies, not as superstition or mystical fantasy, but as a rigorous phenomenology of consciousness itself. When one encounters the Hermetic map of the psyche, one faces a provocative claim that the human mind is not a blank slate, nor a mere product of environment and genetics, but rather a theater populated by archetypal forces that precede individual experience. These forces, traditionally associated with the 7 classical planets, are not celestial bodies exerting literal influence, but rather symbolic representations of fundamental psychological dynamics that shape perception, motivation, and identity. The contemporary skeptic might dismiss such a framework as pre-scientific cosmology, yet this dismissal often stems from a categorical error. The Hermetic system does not claim that Mars the planet causes aggression. Rather, it proposes that the principle called Mars, assertiveness, boundary enforcement, the capacity for healthy aggression, exists as a structural component of the psyche itself. Whether one calls this Mars, the warrior archetype, or the assertive function, matters less than recognizing the phenomenon it describes. The question that initiates the Hermetic journey is deceptively simple. Who is speaking when you think? What constellation of forces generates the internal monologue you identify as yourself? Modern psychology has begun to acknowledge what Hermeticism has long maintained, that the unified I is something of an illusion, a narrative constructed atop a multiplicity of drives, complexes, and sub-personalities. The Hermetic map offers a structured approach to this multiplicity, transforming chaos into comprehensible order. This is not mere taxonomy for its own sake. The practitioner who learns to identify these archetypal forces gains something of immense practical value, the ability to recognize when one is possessed by a particular energy rather than consciously wielding it. There is a world of difference between being seized by martial rage and choosing to assert a boundary with deliberate force. The former is unconscious identification, the latter is psychological sovereignty. The Hermetic map divides the psyche into 7 primary archetypal forces, each corresponding to what the ancients called the 7 governors or 7 planets. To understand this system properly, one must first dispense with literalism. These are not astronomical claims, but psychological ones, a symbolic language for describing the fundamental energies that compose human consciousness. The first principle is lunar, the lunar force, representing the receptive, reflective, and imaginative dimension of mind. Lunar governs memory, dreams, and the capacity for emotional attunement. In psychological terms, this is the domain of the unconscious, the vast repository of images, sensations, and unprocessed experiences that condition present awareness. Jung would later call this the realm of the personal and collective unconscious, but the Hermetic tradition had already mapped its contours centuries earlier. Lunar is the mirror in which all other forces are reflected, the passive witness that receives impressions without imposing structure. The second principle is Mercury, the mercurial intelligence, quick, adaptable, and fundamentally communicative. Mercury represents the rational mind, but not in the narrow sense of cold logic. Rather, it is the principle of connection-making, the capacity to perceive relationships between disparate elements and weave them into coherent meaning. This is the domain of language, reasoning, and intellectual discrimination. Without Mercury, the psyche would be mute, unable to translate raw experience into symbolic form. Yet Mercury alone produces only cleverness without depth, analysis without synthesis. The third principle is Venus, the force of attraction, harmony, and aesthetic sensibility. Venus represents the evaluative function, the capacity to determine what is beautiful, desirable, or worthy of pursuit. This is not mere hedonism, but the fundamental act of valuing itself, without which no choice is possible. Venus establishes what matters, creating the magnetic pull towards certain experiences and the repulsion from others. In contemporary psychology, this might be understood as the motivational substrate, the effective charge that makes certain objects appear salient in the field of consciousness. The fourth principle is soul, the solar consciousness, representing the center of identity, the I am that serves as the organizing principle of experience. Soul is the seat of will, the executive function that decides, initiates, and maintains the coherence of the self over time. This is the principle of individuation, the force that distinguishes self from other, and maintains the integrity of personal boundaries. Without soul, the psyche fragments into a collection of competing drives with no central authority. Yet soul can become tyrannical, suppressing all other voices in the name of a rigid self-concept. The fifth principle is Mars, the martial force of assertion, boundary maintenance, and directed aggression. Mars represents the capacity to say no, to cut away what does not serve, to defend what is valuable against encroachment. This is not violence for its own sake, but the discriminating edge that prevents dissolution into undifferentiated merger. Mars is the sword that separates, the fire that purifies through destruction. Contemporary psychology recognizes this in the concept of healthy aggression, the capacity to protect one's territory, enforce limits, and pursue goals despite obstacles. The sixth principle is Jupiter, the expansive, synthesizing force of growth, optimism, and meaning-making. Jupiter represents the upward and outward movement of consciousness, the desire to expand beyond current limitations, to incorporate new territories of experience, to find overarching patterns that unify disparate elements. This is the philosophical impulse itself, the search for comprehensive understanding that can contextualize individual experience within a larger framework. Jupiter is the principle of hope, the faith that growth is possible and that life contains inherent purpose. The seventh principle is Saturn, the contracting, crystallizing force of limitation, structure, and necessity. Saturn represents the boundaries of the possible, the weight of time, the inexorable demand that fantasy submit to reality. Where Jupiter expands, Saturn contracts. Where Jupiter promises growth, Saturn demands discipline. This is the principle of maturation, the acceptance of constraint that paradoxically enables mastery. Saturn is the teacher of hard lessons, the force that transforms potential into actual through the crucible of limitation. The Hermetic doctrine maintains that psychological health consists not in the dominance of any single principle, but in their dynamic equilibrium. A psyche dominated by lunar becomes passive and dissociated. One dominated by Mars becomes aggressive and brittle. The work of self-knowledge from this perspective is the work of conscious relationship with each archetypal force, learning to invoke its energy when appropriate and to restrain it when excessive. This is not a static map, but a dynamic system. The seven principles exist in complex relationships of support and opposition. Mercury and Venus must cooperate for intelligence to serve beauty. Mars and Saturn must balance for aggression to become disciplined force. The Hermetic practitioner learns to read these internal dynamics as one might read weather patterns, recognizing when a particular energy is gathering strength and what its emergence will demand. The Hermetic path of psychological integration unfolds through distinct stages, each characterized by an encounter with one or more archetypal forces. This is not a linear progression, but a spiral, in which the practitioner repeatedly visits each domain at greater depths of understanding. The first stage is the recognition of multiplicity. The aspirant begins by observing with as much objectivity as possible the variety of voices, impulses, and tendencies that arise within consciousness. This stage demands a particular kind of honesty, the willingness to acknowledge aspects of oneself that contradict the preferred self-image. One discovers, for instance, that the compassionate persona maintained in social situations coexists with ruthless calculative tendencies in private thought, or that beneath philosophical sophistication lies a bedrock of primal fears and desires that sophisticated language merely conceals. The Hermetic map provides a vocabulary for this multiplicity. The practitioner learns to identify when Mercury is active, when the mind is spinning arguments, making connections, explaining itself. They recognize Venus in the sudden pull of attraction, the aesthetic shudder that indicates encountering something aligned with deep values. They feel Mars in the heat of indignation, the instinctive recoil from boundary violations. Each recognition is an act of disidentification. I am not this force, rather this force moves through me. The second stage is the study of imbalance. Having recognized the multiple forces, the practitioner examines which ones dominate and which remain suppressed. This reveals the characteristic distortions of one's psyche, the habitual patterns that determine response before conscious choice becomes possible. Someone dominated by lunar might live in a fog of unrealized potential, eternally receptive but never decisive. Someone dominated by Mars might bulldoze through life, effective but isolated, unable to receive feedback or adjust course. The Hermetic tradition describes this as identifying one's ruling planet, not an astrological determination, but a psychological recognition of which archetypal energy has colonized the center of consciousness. This ruling force colors all perception, making certain experiences visible while rendering others invisible. The martial type struggles to understand the Venusian experience of surrender to beauty. The solar type cannot fathom the Saturnian wisdom of accepting limitation. But imbalance manifests not only in excess but in deficiency. The third stage involves the invocation of the neglected. If one's psyche has systematically suppressed Mars, choosing accommodation over assertion, then psychological growth requires the deliberate cultivation of martial energy. This is not merely behavioral change, deciding to be more assertive, but ontological work, making space for a previously excluded aspect of being to emerge. The Hermetic methods for invocation are varied. Meditation on the symbolic associations of a principle. Mars with iron, fire, the color red, the ram, creates resonance between consciousness and the archetypal pattern. Ritual enactment, in which one deliberately adopts the gestures and language associated with a force, provides embodied access to its energy. Study of mythology, examining how cultures personified these principles in their gods, reveals the phenomenology of each archetype through narrative form. This invocation is not without danger. The neglected aspect has been suppressed for reasons, often because early experiences suggested that expressing this energy would result in punishment, abandonment, or annihilation. When Mars first emerges in someone who has spent a lifetime in compliance, it often arrives with chaotic intensity, burning bridges and demolishing relationships before the ego learns how to modulate its expression. The Hermetic tradition speaks of planetary dignities and debilitations, the recognition that archetypal energies can be well integrated or poorly integrated, refined or crude. The fourth stage is the alchemical marriage, the cultivation of conscious relationship between complementary principles. The practitioner learns that soul requires Saturn, that will without discipline becomes mere willfulness, that Venus requires Mercury, that attraction without discrimination leads to entanglement with what ultimately cannot nourish, that lunar requires Mars, that receptivity without boundaries becomes dissolution. These marriages are not mergers in which one principle absorbs another, but rather conscious dialogues in which each maintains its distinct character while serving a larger purpose. The alchemical image is apt. Two substances that, when properly combined under the right conditions, produce something qualitatively new without losing their essential natures. The practitioner in this stage develops what might be called psychic bilingualism, the capacity to shift registers as circumstances demand. They can access lunar receptivity when listening to another's pain, shift to mercurial analysis when a problem requires strategic thinking, invoke martial force when a boundary must be defended, and return to solar clarity when direction must be chosen. This fluidity is not inconsistency but mastery, the ability to employ the appropriate tool for the task at hand. The fifth stage involves confronting what Hermeticism calls the shadow of each planet, the ways in which every archetypal force contains the seeds of its own pathology. Solar consciousness can calcify into narcissistic grandiosity. Venusian appreciation can degrade into aesthetic posturing. Martial assertion can become sadistic domination. Saturnian discipline can harden into masochistic self-punishment. The shadow work specific to the Hermetic path requires recognizing that one's deepest psychological pathologies often stem from virtues taken to excess or applied in inappropriate contexts. The person who prides themselves on compassionate receptivity may be enacting an exaggerated lunar that prevents necessary confrontation. The one who celebrates their rational clarity may be using Mercury to avoid the discomfort of feeling. This stage demands what might be called phenomenological precision, the ability to distinguish between the healthy expression of an archetypal force and its pathological manifestation. Healthy Mars enforces necessary boundaries. Pathological Mars seeks domination for its own sake. Healthy Saturn accepts limitation as the condition of mastery. Pathological Saturn rejects growth in the name of a rigid order. The sixth stage is the development of the witness, the cultivation of a center of consciousness that can observe the play of archetypal forces without identifying with any single one. This witness is sometimes called the higher octave of soul, the solar consciousness that has transcended the egoic need to control and instead presides over the inner assembly with benevolent awareness. From this witnessing position, the archetypal forces are no longer experienced as overwhelming compulsions, but as weather patterns moving through the psyche. One feels anger arising and recognizes Mars is active now. One notices the pull of desire and observes Venus is asserting itself. This creates a crucial gap, the space of freedom in which conscious choice becomes possible. The seventh and final stage, which is never truly final, but rather an ongoing practice, is the dynamic equilibrium. The practitioner has learned to consciously orchestrate the archetypal forces, invoking and restraining them as wisdom demands. This is not control in the sense of suppression, but rather skill in the sense of artistry, knowing when to apply which energy, how much, and for how long. At this stage, the Hermetic map transforms from an intellectual schema into lived wisdom. The practitioner no longer thinks about the seven principles. They perceive through them, recognizing in every situation which archetypal dynamics are in play and what the moment requires. Life becomes a kind of dance, in which one moves fluidly between different modes of being while maintaining coherence of purpose. The Hermetic path, like all genuine psychological work, inevitably encounters what might be called the crisis of fragmentation, the moment when the recognition of multiplicity threatens to dissolve the very notion of a coherent self. If I am merely a constellation of competing archetypal forces, then who is the I that speaks this sentence? If consciousness is a theater of ancient energies playing out timeless patterns, then in what sense do I possess agency, autonomy, or authentic choice? This crisis typically emerges in the third or fourth stage of practice, once the initial enthusiasm of self-discovery gives way to the more difficult realization of just how conditioned, how mechanical, how utterly predetermined one's responses appear to be. The practitioner observes their decisions being made by the interplay of forces, watches their insights emerge from the friction between archetypal energies, and begins to suspect that what they have called self is merely a narrative fiction constructed after the fact to maintain the illusion of unity. The existential vertigo that accompanies this recognition cannot be overstated. One stands before an abyss in which the comfortable certainty of identity dissolves. If even the most intimate sense of I, the feeling of being the author of one's thoughts, is revealed as a construct, then what remains? The temptation toward nihilism is profound. If the self is illusion, why not abandon the labor of integration? Why not simply acknowledge the mechanical nature of existence and surrender to whatever forces happen to be dominant? The Hermetic tradition has long recognized this crisis and offers a response that is neither comforting nor dismissive. The response begins with a paradox. The recognition that one is not a unified self is itself a function of a certain kind of consciousness, specifically the mercurial capacity for metacognition combined with the solar drive for coherence. In other words, the crisis of fragmentation is itself evidence of a synthesizing awareness that transcends the fragments it observes. This is not a logical argument so much as a phenomenological instruction. Turn attention toward the awareness that recognizes multiplicity. This awareness is not itself multiple. It is the stable ground from which multiplicity can be perceived. The Hermetic tradition calls this the divine spark, the inner light or the true self, not another archetype among archetypes, but rather the witnessing consciousness that contains them all. Yet this teaching brings its own danger, the temptation towards spiritual bypassing, the flight into a transcendent identity that uses witnessing as an excuse for dissociation. The practitioner can convince themselves that they have achieved some elevated state of detached awareness, when in fact they have simply added another layer of self-deception. True witnessing does not escape the archetypal forces, but rather holds them all simultaneously, without collapsing into identification with any single one. The crisis deepens when the practitioner realizes that even this witnessing consciousness can be co-opted by archetypal energies. One can witness from a solar position of control, turning the practice into another egoic achievement. One can witness from a Saturnian position of judgment, using awareness as a weapon of self-criticism. One can witness from a lunar position of passive dissociation, observing without ever engaging. What emerges from this repeated disillusionment is something more humble and more profound than the heroic self-mastery promised by popular psychology. The practitioner learns that integration is not about achieving perfect control over the archetypal forces, that itself would be a solar fantasy, but rather about developing a capacity for conscious relationship with them. The goal is not to become a unified self, but to become the space in which multiple selves can coexist without mutual annihilation. This realization brings with it a peculiar kind of grief. One mourns the loss of the simple, coherent identity that was never truly possessed. One grieves the fantasy of self-determination, recognizing the extent to which one's choices have always been shaped by forces larger than individual will. There is a death here, not the death of the body, but the death of a certain kind of innocence about who and what one is. The Hermetic path does not resolve this grief through consolation, but through a kind of alchemy, transforming the lead of existential despair into what the tradition calls philosophical gold. This gold is not happiness in any conventional sense, but rather a quality of presence that can hold paradox without collapsing into either extreme. It is the capacity to acknowledge both multiplicity and unity, to recognize both determination and agency, to accept both limitation and possibility. The crisis of fragmentation, properly navigated, becomes the threshold to what the Hermetic tradition calls the birth of the solar child. Not a return to egoic unity, but the emergence of a new center of consciousness that is not threatened by the play of archetypal forces. This center does not control the forces, but orchestrates them, much as a conductor does not suppress the individual voices of the orchestra, but instead brings them into meaningful relationship. The practitioner who successfully navigates the crisis of fragmentation discovers something unexpected. The goal was never to eliminate multiplicity, but to develop a conscious relationship with it. What emerges from the Hermetic work is not a static, finalized self, but rather a dynamic process, a continual negotiation between archetypal forces under the aegis of witnessing awareness. This integrated state manifests first in a quality that might be called psychological flexibility. The practitioner can shift between different archetypal registers with increasing ease, accessing the appropriate energy for each situation without becoming possessed by it. In a professional context requiring strategic thinking, Mercury rises to prominence. In an intimate relationship demanding emotional attunement, lunar becomes ascendant. When injustice demands response, Mars emerges with clarifying force. Crucially, this flexibility is not cynical adaptation or strategic self-presentation. It is rather the recognition that different situations genuinely call forth different aspects of being, and that authenticity consists not in maintaining a rigid consistency of self, but in allowing the appropriate truth to emerge. The person who responds with martial force to a boundary violation and with Venusian tenderness to a child's vulnerability is not being inconsistent, but appropriately responsive. The second manifestation of integration is a deepening of what might be called phenomenological literacy, the capacity to read the subtle movements of consciousness with increasing precision. The practitioner learns to recognize the first stirrings of an archetypal energy before it fully possesses awareness. They feel the gathering of martial heat before it erupts into rage, notice the pull of Venusian desire before it crystallizes into obsession, sense the weight of Saturnian judgment before it hardens into self-condemnation. This early recognition creates the space for conscious choice. Rather than being blindsided by emotional storms, the practitioner can meet the rising energy with awareness. Mars is emerging. What boundary is being violated? Is this anger serving a legitimate protection, or is it a habitual reaction to perceived vulnerability? The question itself introduces a gap, a moment of freedom in which response need not be merely mechanical. The third manifestation is perhaps the most surprising, a renewed sense of agency that is more modest and yet more real than the naive agency assumed before the work began. The practitioner recognizes that they cannot choose which archetypal forces arise. These emerge from depths beyond conscious control, but they can choose, within limits, how to relate to these forces when they appear. This is not the grandiose freedom imagined by the ego, but it is genuine nonetheless. The freedom to witness, to question, to modulate, and sometimes to consciously invoke or restrain. The fourth manifestation is a transformation in the quality of suffering. The integrated psyche still experiences pain, conflict, and difficulty. These are intrinsic to the human condition. But there is a fundamental shift in how suffering is met. Rather than experiencing pain as an assault on the self, the practitioner recognizes it as information, a signal that some archetypal force is being suppressed, that some necessary function is being denied, that some developmental demand is being avoided. Depression, from this perspective, might reveal an overly constrictive Saturn strangling the life force, or a blocked Mars unable to assert necessary boundaries. Anxiety might indicate a mercurial mind spinning without the grounding of embodied sensation, or a Venusian attachment to outcomes beyond one's control. The symptoms themselves become teachers, pointing toward the specific imbalances that require attention. The fifth manifestation is the development of what the Hermetic tradition calls virtue. Not moral virtue in the sense of conformity to external rules, but rather excellence in the expression of each archetypal force. The practitioner learns to embody each principle in its dignified rather than debilitated form. Mercurial intelligence without sophistry, Venusian appreciation without attachment, martial assertion without cruelty, Saturnian discipline without masochism. This virtue is cultivated through practice, through the repeated effort to express archetypal energies consciously rather than mechanically. Each situation becomes an opportunity for refinement. Each conflict becomes a laboratory for discovering how to balance competing forces. Each failure becomes data for the ongoing work of integration. The final manifestation, which is less an achievement than an ongoing orientation, is what might be called participation in the cosmic order. The practitioner recognizes that the 7 archetypal forces within the psyche are not arbitrary, but reflect fundamental principles that structure reality itself. To integrate these forces is to align one's inner cosmos with the larger patterns that govern existence, not through mystical merger, but through conscious harmonization. This participation brings a peculiar kind of freedom, the freedom that comes from accepting one's place within a larger order. The practitioner ceases to be at war with reality, no longer demanding that existence conform to personal preferences. Instead, they learn to recognize the archetypal dynamics at play in external situations and to respond in ways that honor both the situation's intrinsic nature and their own developmental needs. The integrated psyche, then, is not a finished product, but an ongoing practice, a continual refinement of the capacity to be consciously present to the play of archetypal forces both within and without. It is the work of a lifetime, never complete, always deepening. And yet, even in its incompleteness, it offers something of immense value, the possibility of living with greater awareness, greater flexibility, and greater fidelity to the fullness of what it means to be human. The Hermetic map of the psyche offers neither escape nor salvation, but something perhaps more valuable, a rigorous phenomenology of consciousness that acknowledges both the multiplicity of the self and the possibility of conscious relationship with that multiplicity. It refuses the false comfort of unified identity while avoiding the nihilistic dissolution into pure mechanism. It recognizes that we are less the authors of our inner lives than we imagine, and yet more capable of conscious participation than we fear. In an age that oscillates between neuroscientific reductionism and spiritual fantasy, the Hermetic tradition occupies a middle ground that is simultaneously ancient and urgently contemporary. It understands the psyche as neither purely material nor purely transcendent, but rather as a complex system of archetypal forces that can be known, engaged, and, within limits, consciously harmonized. The practitioner who undertakes this work does not emerge as a perfected being, but as one who has traded the illusion of control for the reality of conscious relationship. They have learned to recognize when they are being spoken through and have cultivated the capacity to speak deliberately. They have discovered that freedom lies not in escaping the archetypal forces that shape consciousness, but in learning to dance with them with increasing skill. The temple you seek was never outside. It is the carefully tended relationship between the multiple gods that speak through you, and the sovereignty lies not in silencing their voices, but in becoming the space where they can be heard.